a Beard by Steve Metzger. Many people consider Abraham Lincoln to be the greatest president in the history of the United States. Today, when we see images of Lincoln, he usually has a beard. That's one of the reasons he's so easy to recognize. On pennies, on $5 bills, at the Lincoln Memorial, and on Mount Rushmore. Why did Abraham Lincoln decide to grow a beard? It all began with a young girl. In the summer of 1860, 11-year-old Grace Biddell lived in Westfield, a small town in New York. There were 7 brothers and sisters in her family and a baby on the way. Grace enjoyed shopping for clothes with her mother, decorating her dollhouse, and playing blind man's bluff with her friends. "I'm going to get you," Grace called out. Family dinners were fun for Grace, except when the discussion turned to the upcoming presidential election. That's when she first heard about a tall, relatively unknown candidate, Abraham Lincoln. "I think Lincoln would make a fine president," Grace's father said. "I agree with his position on banning slavery in any new states that join the Union." "I disagree," said George, one of Grace's brothers. "I'm going to vote for Stephen Douglas." "Me too," said Levant, another brother. "Lincoln's a clumsy backwoodsman who doesn't know anything." "I wish I could vote for Lincoln too," Grace's mother said, "but unfortunately I can't." "It's not fair that Mama can't vote," Grace said. "She's as smart as any man." "Grace, who do you think should be our next president?" George asked. "Well," Grace replied, "if Mama and Papa like Lincoln, I like him too." "Why don't you think for yourself?" Levant said. "You have a brain." "That is what I think," Grace said, stomping off. Grace loved reading all kinds of books. Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the most popular novels of that time, deeply affected her. "Slavery is wrong, Papa," Grace exclaimed, showing him her book. "We don't have any slaves in Westfield, do we?" "No," her father replied. "New York is a free state." "Then I'm proud to live here," Grace said. "If Abraham Lincoln is elected president this fall," her father said, "I think he'll end slavery throughout the whole country." "Oh, I really hope he wins," Grace said. When September arrived, it was time for school. "Goodbye, Mother. Bye-bye, Una," Grace said as she walked out the door. Born in August, Grace's baby sister, Eunice, was already 1 month old. From his desk at the front of the classroom, Grace's teacher talked about Lincoln and Douglas, the 2 main presidential candidates. During afternoon recess, the boys chased one another in a game of tag. Since it wasn't acceptable for girls to take part in active games during school, Grace and her friends played cat's cradle instead. While waiting for her turn, she overheard one of her classmates. "Lincoln's so ugly," a boy said to his friend. "I can't believe he's running for president." "He's not ugly," Grace called out, "and he's going to be the best president ever." In October, Grace's father attended a hometown fair in support of Lincoln. Upon returning home in the evening, he had a surprise for Grace. "It's a picture of Mr. Lincoln," Grace said, holding up a campaign poster. "Thank you, Papa." As Grace walked up the stairs to her bedroom, Levant called out, "He'll never become president with a face like that." "Yes, he will," Grace said. She slammed the door behind her. Moving to a big chair by the window, Grace took a close look at Lincoln's face. She admired his high forehead and serious expression. "But I don't like the way his mouth and chin look," she thought. A shadow fell across Lincoln's face. Grace had an idea. "He would look much better with whiskers," she exclaimed. On October 15th, Grace sat at her desk and wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln. She introduced herself and asked him if he had any daughters. Most importantly, she suggested, "Let your whiskers grow, for your face is so thin." Grace added that women like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. Grace dipped her pen into a bottle of ink and printed, "Honorable Abraham Lincoln, Springfield, Illinois." On the envelope, she placed her letter inside, sealed it, and added a penny stamp. With a bounce in her step, she brought it to the post office. "If Mr. Lincoln answers my letter, Grace thought, I'll certainly have something to show Levant. Later that same week, Abraham Lincoln sorted through his mail. He noticed an envelope that featured the unmistakable handwriting of a child. Lincoln smiled as he read Grace's letter. So, an 11-year-old girl thinks I will increase my chances of getting elected if I let my whiskers grow, he thought. Well, perhaps she's right. A few days later, Grace returned to the post office. Is there something for me? Grace asked David Mann, the postmaster. Everybody in Westfield knew Mr. Mann. Sorry, not today, the postmaster replied after a few minutes. She returned the next day, and the day after that. Still nothing. Finally, on October 22nd, Mr. Mann excitedly handed Grace a letter. It's from Abraham Lincoln, he announced. Mr. Lincoln answered my letter, Grace cried out. I can't believe it. Even though it was only October, a light snow was falling. Grace almost slipped as she ran home. Look what I've got, Mama, Grace shouted as she burst through the door. It's from Mr. Lincoln. He answered my letter. Goodness gracious, her mother replied. I didn't even know you wrote him. It was a secret, Grace explained. Nobody knew but me. Grace went to the parlor and found Levant. Look, she shouted, it's from Mr. Lincoln. Why on earth would Abraham Lincoln write a letter to you, Levant asked. Because I wrote him first, Grace said, and now he answered me. My, Levant said. Lincoln actually wrote a letter to my little sister? Aren't you proud? Asked Grace's mother. Yes, I guess I am, Levant replied. Grace ran upstairs and into her room. She was pleased with every word of Lincoln's letter, until she came to the last sentence. As to the whiskers, he wrote, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affection if I were to begin it now? It sounds like Mr. Lincoln won't be growing whiskers, Grace thought sadly. That's too bad. I thought I was right about that. The election took place on Tuesday, November 6th, 1860. Grace was hoping with all her heart that Lincoln would be the next president. When Grace finally heard the news that Lincoln had won, she jumped up and down with delight. A few months later, on the morning of February 16th, 1861, Grace woke up with the sun. Get out of bed, sleepyhead, she said, shaking her two older sisters. President Lincoln is stopping here on his way to Washington, D.C., remember? Yes, of course, Helen said, rubbing her eyes. But his train won't be arriving until later in the day. I know, Grace replied, but let's get ready now. Along with Grace and her sisters, thousands of people converged at the Westfield train station, hoping to get a glimpse of the new president. I hope he has whiskers, Grace said. When his train arrived, Lincoln stepped out of the last car to address the crowd. As he spoke, Grace stood on her tiptoes. There are too many people, Grace said. I can't see him. There he is, Alice exclaimed, and he does have whiskers. Really? Grace said. Let me see. After a short speech, Lincoln peered into a mass of people. I have a little correspondent in this place, he announced, and if she is present, will she please come forward? Who is it? Shouted one of the spectators. Grace Bedell, answered Lincoln. The crowd parted and a man led Grace to Lincoln's train car. He stepped down and shook Grace's hand. You see, Lincoln said, pointing to his whiskers, I let these grow for you, Grace. A thunderous cheer filled the air as Lincoln kissed Grace's cheek and returned to his train car. He waved a U.S. flag as the train pulled away. Blushing with embarrassment, Grace rushed to get away from the train station, racing between horses and buggies and even crawling under a lumber wagon. She left her sisters and ran all the way home. I can't believe it, Grace breathlessly told her mother. Abraham Lincoln wanted to meet me, and he did grow whiskers just like I asked him to. What a story, Grace's mother said. This is the most exciting day of my life, Grace said. I can't wait to tell Papa. And then here are the letters. The first one is Grace's letter to Lincoln, and the second one is Lincoln's response to Grace. And I have these on my Google page so you can take a look at them. And I also have this next page that just gives a little bit of background and tells about Grace Bedell's later life.